Wrong window. Here we go. So I thought we could start with a brief performance of a composition from a series of compositions I've been writing, which kind of, I guess, sets the tone for this talk. It's not really like a lecture, it's more going to be in the terrain of thinking out loud. So we're going to have a thought train, and then you can, hopefully will be some food for thought, and hopefully we can have a good discussion afterwards. So, to start off, I want to start with this guy. Does anyone know this person? Brian Seville. Is not self-proclaimed, but at least independent, calls him that, Britain's most famous and controversial art critic. There is a quote of his which is, I guess, a great quote to sort of define the direction of this performance, but before that we're going to have a look at other quotes by him to first set the tone of him, so we can have a more in-depth reflection on the set quote. So the first one. I don't know what art is, but I do know what art isn't, and it isn't someone walking around with a salmon over his shoulder or embroidering the name of everyone they have slept with on the inside of a tent. Okay, this is kind of, I have to say, it's arguably agreeable. Again, I think someone walking around with a salmon over their shoulder is a good work of art, depending on the time and age it's made in. And about the second part, I don't think it's necessarily a good piece of art if you embroider names of every person you have slept with inside of a tent, unless you do it this way, as the way Chapman Brothers did after the tent initially made by Tracy Emin burnt down in a warehouse fire where also Chapman Brothers' works burnt. And after the fire, press went to Tracy Emin and asked if she could replicate the work, to which she replied that she cannot, because it was made in such a time in her life where it was just a perfect emotional setup for her to produce that work. So Chapman Brothers went ahead and made it for her, a replica, which was exhibited from 2006 on, and is still being exhibited in their exhibitions. Back to the talk. Another quote by Brian Seville: "Only men are capable of aesthetic greatness," which I think is utterly silly. And we're going to come back to this actually. Moving on, this is a quote that is of interest to me. This is him talking about performance art.
If you every now and then move a bit, then we can.
Oh, sorry, of course.
Can read it also.
Oh yeah, sure. This is him talking about performance art. It has absolutely nothing to do with painting, sculpture, drawing, printmaking, or any other ancestral form of art. Now, this is again arguably agreeable, but of course, this is not the whole quote. The whole quote is: "Performance art is new, but that doesn't make it art. It only makes it a thing silly people go to see. It has absolutely nothing to do with pain, blah, 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 so on and so forth." And then this is, I guess, the catchy part. Neat people who will say, "No, this has nothing whatever to do with art. This is rubbish." Now, this is rubbish part is, I think, the most interesting catch of it, because I kind of understand the way he's approaching it. He's saying that, I guess, I'm just speculating now, performance art doesn't necessarily have a connection with painting, sound, so on and so forth, because all of these art forms usually have a start and a process that is somewhat laid out, and then it is done, then it's put in a gallery and so on and so forth, where it's more or less left to die. And with performance art, you usually have the start, as with all the things, the process or the way, the path it takes doesn't necessarily have to be really strictly laid out. It doesn't need a pitch perfect time-coded score or whatever, and it doesn't necessarily have to have a perfect ending to it, which I guess might be his point. And I actually completely disagree even with the previous one, where he has nothing to do with the other forms of art. Moving on. this is the way I see it. Performance art is somewhat equal to intermediate art. It is not mutually inclusive, as in not every work of intermediate art has to be a piece of performance art, but I think every piece of performance art is in a way an intermediate art, because at the end of the day in performance art you will have aspects of sound, that's maybe composition, you might have painting, you might have sculpture, you might have dance and so on and so forth. And we will come back to this as well. Moving on. I want to talk about this one analogy that I find really valuable for this discussion, and it is about how we perceive things and how that changes over time. You see, this is an analogy within the realm of music. To begin with, we have the Grosse Fuge, or the Grand Fugue by Ludwig van Beethoven, which was pretty problematic for lots of circles, like when it was first written, which was, I think, in 1825. Six. Whatever. People called it eclectic, eccentric, apocalyptic even, and to this day I think, in again certain circles, this stands as the biggest needle within his entire array of compositions. Let's call it noise for the thing that it was back then. And if we come to today, you can find this song on a Spotify radio, right next to, what was the piece's name again? And Schönen blauen Donau, which is pretty boring and classical. Thus, I can say this has evolved into what we can call dinner music. And moving on from that, what we consider noise, for example, today, which may be Merzbow, the prolific Japanese noise artist, maybe in 100 years' time, it will also be dinner music, which are better picture for dinner with interracial friends and so on and so forth. Or it might as well be elevator music, or EDM for that matter. So this is one thing that's really important, I guess, in both when it comes to performance art. As in, people do things, and when they're done, they're either revolutionary or they spark a bit of controversy. But the way we see things, the way we're accustomed to things, changes over time. Not necessarily because the things themselves change. It's not like people are now completely knowledgeable about classical music composition and so on and so forth, thus claim that dinner. No, it's because other forms of more controversial or more on-the-edge things have evolved. Like when you look at in a world where AC/DC or metal bands and so on and so forth, or free jazz exists, and in the ears of people, it pretty much equals to dinner music in the ear of a regular Joe. Now it's quiz time. So, pop quiz. This is what I like to call performance or not, or we can also call it performance or meme, or maybe we can also even call it performance or content. And by content, I mean things that are created for the sole intent of being content, and maybe even consumable content, like media content. Be it YouTube videos, be it movies, or like stage antics, stunts, whatever. Okay, let's see how well you're gonna hold up. We're gonna do it really simple. I'm going to explain to you one event that has occurred, stripping it of its context and things that it relates to. Like, for example, right now I'm giving you a presentation about this thing. I made a performance piece and I slapped myself. The way I would describe it to you in this context would be, person slaps themselves, right? And you're supposed to guess if it's performance or content. And where we're going to do it is I'm going to ask you to clap if you think it's performance, and then I'm going to ask you to clap if you think it's content. Here we go. Man sits on laps of strangers. Clap if you think it's performance. Clap if you think it's content. That is correct. This is a YouTube video by Epic 5 TV. Let's have a look.
Oh shit! Oh gonna send a sound card to
Exactly. If you
jack
feel
out.
like it changed the output to the mini jack and not to the HDMI.
Because
We
now
also-
the
To the
projector
internal
is...
speakers of the projector, which is not
That
great.
is dumb, huh? You are correct. And I should turn it down a bit.
Yeah.
Alright. Let's go. Round 2. Woman sits on laps of strangers. Clap if you think it's performance. Clap if you think it's content. And I guess you thought it was performance? No, it is content by Mo Annette.
What's going on, guys? This is ET. This is on TV. Today we're with Tara from Model Pranksters.
Girls.
Hey, way to go and sit on people, but this time with a female. See what kind of reactions we get.
You ready?
Okay.
Really? You wanna get up?
Well, of course, we're not going to watch the whole thing. This is the name of the video. You can watch it at home if you want. I have to finish this presentation at some point. Moving on. Person brings excrement of the police sources to the police station. Clap if you think it's performance. Clap if you think it's content. That was a performance done by me. Where I collected horse poop from the streets of The Hague and then returned it to the police station. And do I think it's actually a good work of performance art or not? That we will come to later as well. Moving on, round 4. Persons, multiple, are shot by anti-riot equipment designed to be used by embassies. Clap if you think it's performance. Clap if you think it's content. True, this is content from the Jackass movie number 2.
We're here with Daniel Alvarez from ALS Technologies, and why don't you explain what this is and what we're going to be doing?
This is the 460 Stingmore mine. It has approximately 745 pound rubber balls in it. They'll fly out there at about 500 feet per second. They use these charges on the outside of embassies to protect the gates from people trying to break in.
Looks like it's going to suck.
It is, I promise.
Fuck you! Holy shit!
I mean, imagine you do something in the vein of Occupy Wall Street and you have these things popping all over. And they ricochet, of course, because they're rubber balls, right? You hit the wall and then they ricochet to other people. Moving on. Person is shot by a single 22 caliber round. 22 caliber round. Clap if you think it's performance. Clap if you think it's content. This is a piece of performance art by Chris Burden. Which was actually supposed to be an audio piece, and someone happened to be videographing it as well during the time it was done. And the idea was that the bullet was supposed to like just brush it slightly and then hit the wall, but it just went right through his arm. Moving on. Person is shot by a single 50 caliber round. Clap if you think's performance. Clap if you think's content. This is a bit grim though, because the person who did this, Pedro, actually died.
Let's go ahead and show them what we have in store for our first video.
On June 26th last year, she says she finally gave in. Perez told investigators that Pedro Ruiz had showed her a book before where a bullet didn't fully pierce a hardcover book.
I'm just not going to just set it and just shoot it. No. I'm going to stand behind it. And Mona Lisa is going to shoot it.
For 15 minutes, the camera first captures his rambling plans.
Every week, I'm going to be bringing you guys new videos, crazy videos.
Well, the Norman County attorney denied releasing video of the single shot that killed Ruiz, calling it offensive to common sensibilities. A transcript of the audio reveals her hesitation. "Babe, I'm not doing this. I can't. If I kill you, what's going to happen to my life? Like, no, this isn't okay. As long as you hit the book, you'll be fine," Ruiz says. These pictures show she did, standing an arm's length away. A young man craving fame who got it, for all the wrong reasons.
I may fail, but if I fail, I want to die trying.
Kind of sounds like actually Chris Burden in a way, right? I mean, which was also there. Like he told his friend, "Yeah, just shoot the wall. You'll be fine. I'll be fine." And then it just went right through. Anyway, next round. Person paints on chewing gums on the ground. Clap things perform.
What's the distinction between content and performance art again?
That is for you to judge.
Okay.
I mean, in a way, I guess the distinction here is that performance art is made with a reason or a context or some thought behind it, whereas content is made to be just consumed. Especially in the domain of YouTube. But then again, of course, someone earlier came to me and said, yeah, I mean, what's the difference, man? I mean, come on, YouTube and performance is more or less the same thing. Maybe, that's what we're kind of, I guess, speculating here. Person paints on chewing gums on the ground. Clap for things performance. Clap for things content. This was a piece of performance art done by Ben Wilson, where he was painting gums on the floors of New York City. And don't jump at me and say this is just a painting project done on the ground. People walk on all fours, cutting through traffic. Performance? Content? This is a performance art done by Amal Kenevi in Egypt.
Where was that, sorry? Where you said what?
This was in Egypt, Cairo, in 2009, if I am not mistaken. Or 2006. Person plants trees on roads where active traffic flows. Performance? Content? This is content by Copy Person.
What's up, guys? 2 days ago when I was driving around New York City, I hit a pothole with my car and my tire popped and I had to buy a new one. So I was thinking to myself, as New Yorkers, how can we avoid these potholes? Because the city doesn't clean them up until the summer. So I was thinking, had I seen a plant inside the pothole, I would have drove around the plant and not hit the pothole. So today I'm going around with different sized plants, put in different sized potholes, so New Yorkers avoid them. Now people will see this and they won't drive over it. See what I'm saying? Looks nice, beautiful, look at that. Thank you. Yeah, we were doing, look, no one's gonna go over it and break their tire now. Then we put the plant in the hole so people don't go over it. You know what I'm saying?
It actually works. That's the good part about it. This is, I think, the video that makes you want to look at the history of performance and want to say, fuck you. And this is actually a genre of videos called social experiments, which is quite popular on the internet. Was, at least in the era of 2010. It's crazy. Moving on. Next round. Person follows random people around until they enter a private property. Performance. Content. This is performance by following piece, which I guess would have been considered a felony if it was done in 2018. Bonus round. Okay, so if you get this one right, you can forget about all the ones that you got wrong, alright? And I'm gonna help you out even. I'm gonna give you a tip. This is Last Stand by Chris Burden, where he stood in a field outside the airport of Los Angeles, where there was no one aside from him and the person who took this photograph. He aimed his gun to the first plane that took off and shoot one bullet. Do you think this is performance or do you think this is photography? Performance? Photography? You're wrong, this is a sculpture. Okay, so now we have to go back a bit to there are these certain themes, I guess, which kind of is a reoccurring thing within these things, and I really want to go into my train of thought, which is about how the context of performance art was defined. And to do that, we start with part 1, Futurism. So, in 1909, we have Marinetti, who was outside with 2 of his friends, who arguably maybe had a couple of too many Peronis. I don't know if Peroni existed back then. And then he sees a tram passing by from a distance, and he thinks of the tram as if it looked like villages trembling, and that really touched him. So he told to his friends, his exact wording, that they have to go and caress the breasts of certain beasts. So they go to their cars. He lays on top of his car for a while, and then he decides to jump on it, feeling really emotional about the whole thing. He jumps in his car, starts speeding through the Italian countryside, being really happy, and to his surprise, he's crossed by 2 Italian bicycle riders, and which really pisses him off, but nevertheless, not to hurt people, he has to turn the steering wheel, and he ends up in a ditch crushed under his car. And of course he doesn't die, because back then cars weren't such big hunks of metal, they looked more like this, which is mostly wood, so if you fall under this you don't die. But the peculiar thing is, he was actually mad at the people that were on the bicycles, because he thought that they were crossing this path of power that he was controlling with the flimsy, man-powered vehicles. And he was actually quite fond of being crushed under his car. He explains it as a really nice, fulfilling feeling, and the way he describes the event where fishermen came by and lifted his car off of him, he describes it as a dragon moving away from his body. Now, I think this kind of sounds like this movie, huh? The whole car crashes and how he describes it. Anyway, I think Cronenberg was really inspired by this particular event. Anyway, after this whole thing, Marinetti gets together with his trio of friends and writes what is now known as Manifesto of Futurism, published on 11th of December 1909. I think December or November. Marinetti had a thing for 11th. Although it wasn't written on 11, it was published on 11. Frankly enough, on a French newspaper. That's kind of confusing, I guess. Okay, so let's go through the parts in the Manifesto of Futurism. 1, we want to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and rashness, which I guess is kind of on point with what happened to him and how he describes what happened to him. 2, we want to exalt movements of aggression, feverish sleeplessness, the double march, the perilly sleep, the slap and the blow of the fist. So he's really talking about, I guess, this vicious thing, this aspect of power, rashness, and basically overall vicious things. He goes on, there is no masterpiece that has not an aggressive character. Poetry must be a violent assault on the forces of the unknown, which I actually really like. Of course, questionable if his poetry was really that violent assault on the forces of the unknown, but I have to say it was quite revolutionary. And then we have this part, we want to glorify war, only cure for the world. This is the part where he kind of funnels into his whole nationalistic militarist ideas, I guess. Militarism, patriotism, and the destructive gesture of anarchists, which puts a whole big question mark in your head, because it's when you first think about it, it sounds off. But again, in 2009 we have 1909 we have these guys who would also go on and serve the military during World War I. And it also makes sense when you look at the whole thing. I mean, of course, this is a direct reflection on the Industrial Revolution and what it brought onto the world. And of course they love tanks, guns, and so on and so forth. But then he goes on with the beauty of ideas which kill and contempt for women, which puts another whole bunch of question marks in your head. Guess who would have really liked it back then? This guy. And then he also wants to demolish museums and libraries, fight morality, feminism, and all opportunist and utilitarian cowardice. Now I think, in a way, what is the point here is not necessarily imagery of militarism or destructive gestures, but it's more or less using this as a method or as a driving force. Taking this, in a way, image and ghost of this thing and using it as a technique, a method in practice. Luckily, the people who will come after these guys won't be falling into this whole silly pro-war and anti-women things. Even actually next year. Oh, sorry, yeah, I had a previous slide, yes. So yeah, this is, I think, the main aspects of this whole story and the manifesto. Violence and danger as a driving force, anti-institutionalism, which I guess will also is a thing we will be seeing in the further eras, rejecting age-old customs and forms, and the new frontiers as methodology, which is what I was talking about when I said industrial revolution and machinery and war. And as said, the people who will come after him won't be falling into this whole silly ideas of pro-war and anti-women, such as these people, who were futurist women who wrote a direct reply to him a year after. And they also wouldn't be bothering with that whole, oh, do not eat pasta because it makes you slow kind of crap. Does anyone actually know the content of this book? It's pretty interesting how this book is taken in art schools. It's basically something that Marinetti did later in life, Futurist Cookbook. He claims that, for example, it talks about lots of different stuff, right? It talks about experimental methods as a way of cooking, but I guess the more interesting things is that he says eating should be a nationalist act. And he says that Italians should not eat pasta, but instead should eat Italian-grown rice. And he also says that eating pasta slows down your body, and both men and women alike should be always fierce and formidable, and thus should not eat things that slow down their bodies. And what I find really funny is that how this book is still taken in art schools, stripped completely of its nationalist and militarist undertones. Okay, this is the end of chapter 1. Again, this was what we have to keep in mind moving on to the next chapter. So after Futurism, what do we have? In a way, under its in its reflection, we have Dada, which were artists who were kind of fond of the works of Futurism and were, in a way, anti-war, finally. And then what do we have after that? For that, we have a small intervention, and we have a small story of John Cage and two fellow men. So, at some point, John Cage was teaching in New York his lessons about music composition, and two men attended his classes whose names were George Brecht and Al Hansen. And George Brecht always said that the surname Brecht, even though he took it later on, has absolutely nothing to do with Bertolt Brecht. He just thinks it sounds cool. So they're in the class, with of course a bunch of other people. On one of the first classes, John Cage goes ahead and says to the class, "How many of you know how to read music?" A bunch of people raise their hands. Al Hansen doesn't, neither does George Brecht. And then he asks another question. How many of you know how to play an instrument? Almost everyone raises their hands, including Al Hansen, aside from this guy, George Brecht. And then John Cage goes up to him and says, "Good. At least you don't have anything to unlearn." So then we have, of course, from this school, Fluxus, which came from people that, those two were kind of pioneers of the whole thing. And in Fluxus, what do we have? We have, I guess, what you can call happenings in the Fluxus school of composition, which were coined by Alan Coprow. He called happenings basically as, I guess, what you can call... Okay, his idea was that taking any event that you do daily, any happening, and either doing it the way you do it, either taking it and putting it in another context, in another stage, and then performing it, which would also be a happening, or it could be an anti-happening where you don't do that one certain thing. So if you don't drink your morning coffee, you're basically performing an anti-happening. And he also reasoned that more or less whatever you do, you produce a sound while doing it. And given that any practice that produces sound, produces image in any case, so does playing music or playing a composition is also a visual thing, he concludes that happenings are musical compositions, which I guess is pretty reasonable. And then, what do we have in Fluxus compositions? We again have violence, danger, and challenging a custom. And to explain these a bit further, of course we also have absurdity. To explain this a bit further, we have violence against violence, given the time and era these works were produced, which is 60s, which had, the post-World War II, and given it was America, you had the whole Vietnam War happening in the later years, which kind of fueled the anti-violence, anti-war connotations within Fluxus works. Danger, we have a thing in it as, it's not war like this guy, which is like, tanks and all that. We have danger as the only decisive factor of what can or cannot be done. Now, this is, I think, a pretty important point in this whole sense of musical compositions. Yep. Challenging the custom, which I guess in this way the custom is the canon of composition, or the canon of Western composition, if you will. And then we have absurdity as loosening the grip of reality. And I have one work that I would like to propose that fits all of these four things perfectly, which is this composition by Phil Corner. One anti-personnel type CBU bomb will be thrown into the audience. What is a CBU bomb? CBU bomb is basically these massive missiles that are full of small cluster bombs, which are in turn also full of cluster bombs, which were used by the American Army during Vietnam War. And sadly, he never managed to perform it, although he did perform a smaller version where he threw a rifle into the audience, which, okay, well, it was loaded. So, now we have this one fella. Does this picture strike any resemblance in anyone's head? Exactly, well, as normal people pronounce it, Dick Higgins. Yet another member of Fluxus, whose compositions I find to be quite ingenious, who also coined the term intermedia art, by the way, which is kind of unknown, it seems. I mean, of course, intermedia is nowadays thrown around kind of an equivalent word to multimedia, but nevertheless. He coined it intermedia, and then he coined this practice as intermedia art. Art is because, you know, where he was basically saying that if you do something while having other elements within it, then it is a practice of intermedia art. Thus, my previous point of being performance art always under the parenthesis of intermedia art. And let's look at a couple of his works. His series called Danger Music, which was why I chose this person. This is the things that I find completely ingenious. They're super clever. We have number 41, take off your old coat and roll up your sleeves. And then, well, these are in no particular order, neither chronological nor conceptual, because it was 4 a.m. when I put these on the slide, so they're a bit mangled. Danger Music number 3. There were the large pack of incense among those present in a moderately large room. Ask each person to burn his or her incense without flame altogether. Darkness throughout. I guess this is a beautiful piece of performance art in that case. Danger Music number 17, which seems to be the crowd pleaser and everyone's favorite given how often it is re-performed. It goes scream, exclamation mark, scream, exclamation mark, scream, no, scream, exclamation mark, scream, exclamation mark. Which is sort of different than the wording that was initially written in. This is May 1962. He wrote it before in 1961 without the extra exclamation marks in the middle, so I don't know if that actually means anything or not. Next one we have number 24. Find it, attack it. Which I also really like. I think this is totally the direction that performance art should still go. It's basically the quintessence of performance art. You know, when you find something, you attack it. Which is also something that's quite often re-performed. I guess people like it. Danger Music number 1. Spontaneously catch hold of a hoist and be raised up at least 3 stories. I mean, I don't know why this is number 1. I am sure he actually numbered them kind of randomly. I like it. It's fun. It's funny. Which can also be a YouTube video, in a way. Danger Music number 8. Play it safe. I think it's also pretty ingenious, not because it is this thing, but it is within this other piece of composition. Next, we have Danger Music number 9 for non-drum pike. Volunteer to have your spine removed. And now we have this thing that I was talking about previously, the danger as the sole determining factor of what can and what cannot be done, and this should not keep you away from writing a composition. I mean, of course, you can also write a composition that is impossible to play on the piano for a piano, but I guess this is more radical. At least it was for 1962. Again, danger is a determining force of what can or cannot be done. I mean, danger is a thing that has been around for a lot of time as a both aesthetical value and a thing that we like, from this thing you can buy on Amazon, which is erotic self-asphyxiation device to this picture. I mean, you see, did you see the aesthetic of danger from this thing? The waves that can crush you, and this whole like inner feeling of looking at them. I think they're kind of more or less conveying the same idea. And from this, now we come to the part where I kind of crap out because I didn't really practice this part on my own. Spectras, which I guess in this case we will be talking about the spectra of danger, of violence, and the spectra of internet and YouTube. This is a graph. How do I do the laser pointer again?
Button called laser.
Ah.
Somewhere down.
Nope. It's on the upper.
Is it?
Well,
Aha, laser.
no.
Okay, violent deaths and conflicts and one-sided violence since 1989. So this is kind of a more recent graphic. You have the spike here, which was a genocide somewhere in Africa, if I remember correctly. And you have this like tiny bump right now. My proposal is that we are actually living in pretty violent times still. And okay, you might say that, yeah, what are you talking about? This says 89. This is, sorry?
What is one-sided violence?
One-sided
Oh, okay.
violence that is between a named organization and civilians, such as genocides. So it's basically armed individuals killing unarmed individuals. This is a bit of a better graph, I think, because it goes all the way to 1946, so it's more or less from post-World War II until today. And now we have the 60s, 70s, where most of these things were produced, works of Fluxus, works of Dick Higgins. And we have these cold bearers. In 2016, I think this bump, well, it gets a bit outdated, of course, and the time advances at such an acceleration that is incomparable to all of this period, I guess. But when you look at it, colonial or imperial conflicts, conflicts between states, is basically non-existent, and what we have nowadays is civil conflicts with foreign state interventions and just civil conflicts, well, more or less only civil conflicts with foreign state interventions, which in human lingo translates into proxy war, as what this thing is trying to say. So I would say that we're still living in violent times, and thus it only makes sense if we make works that are in the same vein of violence of that era, because it seems to me that usually theorists, historians, and critics claim that what has been done back then has been done back then because of the reasons back then, and if they're done or something in a similar way is done, it just comes off as edgy or tacky. And I disagree, because we still, of course not as much, but we still do live in violent times. And we have other forms of violence, where you, for example, sit in front of a computer and you just browse internet and your data is taken, your data is used to produce advertisements which sell you some stuff, you're basically all exposed online. And if you are silly enough to put everything that you are and you earn onto the internet, you basically will be subject to one form or another of violence. And when anyone and everyone thinks about this, most of the time, what pops up in people's heads is the stock image with a bunch of zeros and the portal of, oh, it's incomprehensible data business. And it's of course not like there's this one demonic Mark Zuckerberg sitting in front of his computer looking through his webcam into your webcam. But I do have to say we are now experiencing different forms of violence. And we have, for example, these kind of idiots that talk about complete other stuff, misdirecting subjects that actually matter into this whole fake news hype train. And then we have stuff like this, for example, best prank videos wine compilation, which is basically people being violent to each other, spraying each other with like water jests and burning them, or the gone wrong part is basically when someone does stupid and offensive and someone punches them in the face. People dig this. Look at this. It's 28 million views. Look at this like and dislike ratio. It's crazy. People dig this. This is the shift of the paradigm in the human. Like, it would be considered completely outrageous just to spray someone with a water jet or pull the chair out of someone. Now it's an internet content that people actually dig. I mean, there's this chair pulling plank, whatever. 20 million views, and look at this like ratio. I mean, you can die from this. They will have to remove your spine after this. You know, this is crazy. And there is this thing, which I guess is a great comic relief between this both aspects of performance art versus internet and then internet. Well, this guy, Benjamin Bennett, has been doing these videos of sitting and smiling for more than 2-3 years now. He does one more or less. He used to do it once a week, now he's doing it a bit less. Now, is this YouTube performance? This is just to... I put it on because it really confused me and I don't have much to say about it. I think it's just beautiful and I hope you have something to say about it. And I guess in this era, one of the only justifiable works of performance art would be going ahead and nailing your Scotland to the red square in 2013. And of course, now with these kind of talks, you always have to give like a proposal of what can be done. Because he actually did nail himself. And yeah, of course, with these kind of talks where one person just babbles on and complains about lots of things, you would of course expect a proposal or a resolution. The latter of which I do not have, but I do have a proposal, which is some scores that I have been, from a series that I have been working on recently, which are on that table over there. Everyone is free to check them out, and if you would ever like to perform one of those pieces, please take the score home with you, and let me know if you ever end up performing it.
That's the fire alarm.
That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
That's interesting.
Perfect timing. Of course, I left an incense in the other room. Oh, and yeah, this kind of is... Any questions? Any discussion? Or we can do it outside having a smoke, if you will. Is this really remarkable?
You're live.
Yes, great. But we already kind of lost the whole vibe, I guess. I guess
What do you mean? It's enhanced.
Oh yeah.
I think it makes perfect sense.
Okay, so I guess it's discussion time. Can I grab a beer before that?
Sure.
This is part of your performance, right?
Yes.
The fire alarm.
I left some wood burning in the other room.
That's perfect.
Why did you say the conservative English art critic would agree with the futurist manifesto? You said something about that he would approve that as art.
It was just a I guess tongue-in-cheek joke. I didn't say he would completely agree with it. It was just this one part that is, you know how he said that only men are capable of producing aesthetical works. It was just a throwback joke.
Well, my performance question would be, that's...
Can I have the keys?
Yeah?
Can I have the key, please?
In the table. Here. No. Here.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Just proceed. Until we're evicted.
Yeah.
Heb jullie een sleutel van het knop daar?
No, but we might be able to go through there. I'm not sure.
No, there's no stairs over there.
Okay, fair enough. In that case, no.
I'll go get the keys.
Yeah, great. I'm not sure. So currently it's on the second floor. The fire department is coming, but the door out there is locked, so we can't really get in. We don't know exactly what's going on. It might just be.
And I thought they had a key for the fire exit.
We'll just come and let you out here. No, I don't like you. Stay in.
My grandiose performance piece where I lock you in a room and set fire to it.
Somebody left their pot on the stove.
So you were saying?
Yeah. I was saying, that's your presentation obviously is extremely fun And my foremost question is why exactly? Like why, especially in light of the previous presentation where it was so much about the dichotomy between enjoyment and content. Like often I felt that the points that you're making are very valid, but the argumentations are reduced to these questionable but really fun connections, similar to what James pointed out previously.
Yeah.
Of like, is it?
Let me put it to you this way: like when Eric, when he started his talk, he openly presented his position and his practice, and thus set the tone to the presentation. Then maybe it's better later than never. I guess my position here is just a person who talks a lot, and maybe even a slapstick comedian, or maybe even. I guess more or less the idea here is just talking about some stuff that has happened in a way that it will maybe stay in people's heads. And I just wanted to express what kind of is a train of thought in my head. That's why I said it's more or less thinking out loud rather than a lecture where you're supposed to sit through and leave with a conclusion or some knowledge at the end.
Because I think if it's a thinking process that you want to demonstrate, it's not that well argumented.
Mm-hmm.
It often has like very scheduled points.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's comedy, I think it's kind of great that we finally have like comedy for contemporary artists.
Comedy, actually. I am not a great theorist nor a great researcher in any way. I think I managed to talk somehow. So yeah, I guess this is more like in a way comedy as well. You can call it comedy. I guess I would be perfectly fine with that.
But I think it brings up interesting connections between YouTube as a medium and kind of past performance arts, and when are these videos performance art? Is Jackass Flux's art, or is it bullshit? There's a lot of masochism in there that's done in the name of art.
I mean, two things I haven't really included in the presentation. One of them is a quote by a television host who was talking about Chris Burden's work, and he said, "Yeah, I have been following him since the shooting piece he did, and I guess if this is art, so was World War II." And then I saw this other YouTube comment while I was fishing for some YouTube videos that someone posted under a performance of Chris Burden, which said, "Chris Burden, the original Jackass!" Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. So yeah, it is, I guess, that sort of comical thing that wasn't really intentional, but kind of came out to be so, because the world that we live in now is just happened to be this way because of the things that happened to me. Like, we had Jackass, so that someone can go online and say, "Yeah, Chris Burden, the original Jackass."
No, I agree with what you're saying about people removing chairs, and that's dangerous, but they are sort of allowed to do it under the principle of we're creating YouTube content. If you just do it to a random person, that's you being a dick, whereas I mean, it still is when you put it up on YouTube, but arguably there it's for...
I have to show you something now that you mentioned this with the chair. So the video I showed with the chair pulling, I think I have it on my hard drive. You have to see the beginning of the video, which is incredibly depressing. Let's see. Do I have it here? No. Okay, so basically they put this frame at the beginning of the video where it says disclaimer. This is done by people who have a PhD in chair pulling. Do not attempt this on your... No. Ha ha, super funny, but it doesn't really justify the jerkness that you're doing onto people. And I mean, people dig it apparently. It's what people love to consume while they're eating their dinner or lunch.
This is art.
I don't think so.
So it was a couple of art school students at Cloud Dance Lab who sucked at making popcorn.
I know.
When is this red thing?
Whenever the fire department shows up.
Oh, they have to show up.
Well, it did
But are we all good? We can continue.
it did instill a sense of danger.
I guess what makes it art is not the act itself.
So it's
This is why we're better than the reading room.
6 vans,
We're just sitting here
here's
talking.
masks, and they come in here and take us out.
Oh, I might have to go and open it.
Yeah, I think. Okay, so I'm going to say something, but it's going to also contradict one of my previous points, but nevertheless, here it goes. Is it art? No. Is Chris Burden getting shot in the arm art? I think so, because there you have this sort of communication of going to someone and saying, I want you to shoot me in the arm. And he says, okay. And there was another piece where he wanted
Yeah,
to...
but that doesn't make it art.
What makes it art then?
Yeah, that's, I don't know. Like, then any action will be art, if it's intentional.
I think it's...
You shoot me in the arm. Okay, boom. So now it's art? That's a bit too easy, man.
I guess. But should it be like super difficult? How much
No,
thought?
no, shouldn't. That's not the point. But if I ask the child to play a game, yeah, play a game. Is it art? No, it's not art. It's a game.
I guess what makes it art is somewhat the story behind it. For example, this trick question I pulled on you with here, saying that this is a sculpture. Why did I say that? Why do I think it's a sculpture? Because the person who made it says it's a sculpture. Same with the shooting piece, where he says the work is actually not a piece of performance art, but it's a sculpture, and the sculpture being the very instance where he was shot. And same with this one, he claims that this was a sculpture, where the sculpture was him pulling the trigger towards the airplane. So then is it art? If you say that you're making a sculpture.
No, if you say this is art, then it doesn't mean it's art. You just say it is art.
Yeah, of course, but I can't
I
go
mean,
for any.
everybody has it. I'm art. I'm a painter.
It can be art. I mean, what is to be discussed is, I think, if it's good art or bad art. I mean, if you go back to this guy, for example, where he said, I don't know what art is, but I do know what it isn't. This is kind of like an argument. It's like saying everything that is a potato, and everything that's not a potato is not a potato. And then you can reformulate it into everything is either a potato or not a potato. And then you can also you will come to this at the end. I don't know what art is, but I do know what it isn't. I guess the argument more or less here is if it is good art or bad art. Then again, there is also no authority.
Then still everything is art. But it's good or bad. Then every potato is art. But
Sorry.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention that you started to talk about Dadaism, but you didn't talk about that Dadaism. So they were trying to achieve that to art be as a normal thing in life. So everything what we do, they try to extend art, or I don't know, to the real life. And I think this is the point where everything changed. Everything could be art.
I have
There's the intention.
I have to agree, actually. I mean, given that there is super two famous stories, right, of how the name Dada came to me. One of them goes, he just slit through a dictionary with a knife, it landed on Dada, and the other one is it was named after the first sounds a baby make, kind of in this idea that it should be childish. And is everything art? I mean, art. I think it's telling me that I'm bullshitting.
The fire department thinks so.
You're doing it. It's not different.
I mean, for example, Alan Capro claims that most and everything can be art because he says happenings, that things that you regularly
You
do.
use the example of when you brushing these things.
Yeah.
Not every time you brush your teeth is art.
Well, I mean, then you select and isolate one instance of this thing that is ever so
probably
accurate.
then the intention with which you produce the work art. But it's not because it's yes or no toothbrush, it's something else. So it's not the salmon on the shoulder. So salmon on the shoulder can be a work of art. But not any salmon on the shoulder is a work of art, and someone says this is a work of art.
So then,
It's more complicated.
I think Cornelis, if I may,
sure.
that is one understanding of what art can be. And it's kind of, again, an ontological question of if art is its own subject or it's only a sort of a quality, and the subject of that work is the act itself. For example, if the act of walking with a salmon on the shoulder, it's important to claim it if it's an art or not, and that's how it gains content. Or in the other case, art is just a method where you can carry through this action, and the action is the content, and how you get to access to exercise, or not exercise, execute this action, is by saying that it's art, and this is what it allows you to do the action. In that case, it's more just a method or a quality rather than a subject. And I do think that's a valid understanding, that art is really just a method to pull shit off that otherwise you would not be able to do.
Yeah, but then that's also can be a scapegoat for doing things that could be dangerous or slightly.
I think the other one, like, is saying that if it's a subject, that's much more dangerous for quality, because in that case there is no objective. Like in the other case, you can just judge it by examining the act itself, and you don't have to consider if it's art or not. If it's a valid act, which is much easier to judge than if it's a very work of art, is much more straightforward. In that case, you kind of get away from this whole conceptual discussion of what art is and not, which can provide a scapegoat, I think, much easier than the other one, saying that, okay, this is just irrelevant. It came to be, is it valid or not?
I think maybe it's more interesting to look at a lot of the motivations behind a lot of these things. Why is this Burton guy so obsessed with guns?
Yeah.
You know, why did the guy ask his girlfriend to shoot him through a book? Like death wish, idiocy, desperate, YouTube fame, desire. Why did you return a pile of shit to the police department? Is that a piece of art? Is that you pissed off with them not cleaning it up? Is that you feeling that the horses are antiquated royal symbolism? And maybe a lot of these things are kind of acts of social disobedience, or I don't know. What about the guy following people? Is that a comment on privacy of land? Is it a social experiment? Is that like a Sacha Baron Cohen thing?
Yeah.
Is Borat a piece of art? Is Borat entertainment? Is Borat social?
But that's the thing, like, these questions I find much more meaningful. These questions, exactly like any question that you named previously, I find it, yeah, I mean, like, it actually means something. It actually is important, not just a conceptual game.
Well, the other one that's interesting is that experiment that was done about, what was it, electrocuting in America in the 60s, 70s, 80s?
Electrocuting an elephant, or?
No, there was one about people had to do memory tests, and if they got it wrong, supposedly they were being electrocuted.
Sociological experiment.
And then, I mean, arguably, that is more of a performance than I wonder, of a fully scientific thing, because it's based a lot on kind of sensationalism, on these kind of...
I think it was a scientific test.
Because I feel it puts people in a strange situation, just the way that Sacha Baron Cohen and Borat, I don't think is always a true social examination. There's so many parameters of false trust put into the subjects. I feel this, and there is a lot of theatricality about it. The intensity of the screams, the fact that it's videotaped. I almost feel that that was, in some ways, a kind of performance thing for an audience. I don't know. I think even there's an interesting question. And I think, like Sacha Baron Cohen presents it either as comedy to some people, or to other people he presents it as social commentary, but it's such a staged situation.
But there is also the issue, I like this Duchamp formula very much, of when you talk about, especially when you talk about the question of whether something can be regarded as art or not, his suggestion is there is no solution because there is no problem. The thing that for him I think was very important when he started experimenting around, he wasn't alone, right? Mert Oppenheim was busy, and others with this kind of prefabricated objects. They had to be as far removed from any kind of direct intervention of him, except for the act of selecting it, and even the act of selecting should be done as absent-minded as possible and basically as random as possible, so that we can then have an object that can be really viewed in its own right. And I think the main point that he was trying to get at was that any object in any event can be observed by an audience as an aesthetic object or an aesthetic event, so that it shifts entirely the emphasis from the author, the maker, to the observer, let's say, to the audience. So aesthetic perception is something that is typically human quality. And I think Marinetti was actually quite smart in avoiding that trap, because there was this one quote, I think that Walter Benjamin dug that up, I don't know where I encountered it, but it really was like mind-blowing, where there's a later manifesto from the 30s on the Ethiopian colonial war, and there's a whole fragment there where he once again restates his admiration for the beauty of war. And then he goes on and on about geometric formation flights, the architecture of Thames burning villages in the landscape, the smell of putrefaction, so literally burning flesh is a new kind of aesthetic experience. And all of it, he's constantly avoiding to say that any of this is art, but he calls it all the time, he's rebelling against the branding of war as anti-aesthetic. He says this is a new aesthetics. And he doesn't call it art, but then he calls upon the poets and the artists and so on to illuminate their art with this aesthetics of war. So he makes a clear distinction between what is the aesthetic experience of this thing of war and what the artist is doing. It's a very weird figure, this Marinetti, anyway.
It seems to bring up a lot of these kind of, this idea of rationalizations for different acts. Like this kind of war thing, it could be aesthetic, it could be religious, it could be moral, it could be, and I think this is interesting, like the pranks, some small degree of violence in them.
There's something really interesting, because there is the preface to the Manifesto of Futurism, where it describes this nightly drive through Milan.
Yeah.
It also ends in this.
It's that occasion that I was talking about, the countryside of Milan.
Yeah, and then falls into the ditch indeed, and he calls it even a maternal ditch because it's wet and so on. It's terrible. He wants to rid himself of any female involvement. For whatever reason, psychoanalytically, we can have a field day. But one or the other design theorists, I always forget who did that, analyzed this preface entirely. And so in the manifesto is rambling about destroying all the art in the museums and the libraries and sort of getting rid of all cultural heritage, basically. In literary terms of what kind of images and metaphors he was using. And it turns out it's a cross-section of our entire cultural history. So every sentence is constructed in terms of historical metaphors. Byzantine rings, twisted like Byzantine rings, and so on. So there is, it's one big heritage site, this preface. And then he writes a manifesto in which he says, we must destroy all this. So it's completely ambiguous.
With history and
Yeah.
big empires or whatever.
Yeah, so what is it, right? That I think that makes it interesting, that it's so super ambiguous.
I think the funniest thing in this, like the story of Marinity, is that first you have this person with the Futurist Manifesto claiming that everyone that is before like them is more or less obsolete by then, and they also say that the ones come after us will deem us obsolete, because that is the way it should be. The young blood should take the torch of the art and so on and so forth. And even though it's strictly against academies, at some point he decides that futurism is not like taken serious or is written on paper in academy, so he decides to become an academic and moves to Rome to join the academy and write about futurism. I mean,
you find it interesting, this very aggressive, violence proclaiming voice then becomes an academic.
yeah, his life is full of basically hypocrisy, where for years he claimed to be a strict non-believer, and towards the end of his life he was a born-again Christian, he was a Catholic. He was super into nationalism and ideas involving nationalism, and he was educated in France. He published a Futurist Manifesto on a French newspaper. He went to different countries to talk about futurism. He didn't think it was actually a nationalist thing in the later stages. He was just, I guess, a really ambitious person.
Ambiguous. I would say.
Oh, ambiguous, sorry. Well, also kind of ambitious, I have to add.
Yeah, of course. But,
With the things he like, this is the greatest thing, and then completely shifts his opinions about it just to make the previous statement he did stay, kind of, you know.
Sounds a bit lost and dangerous, doesn't it? Trying to navigate through complicated life and world changes.
He did try to join the army again when he was 60, when the Second World War broke out, and then they kicked him out after a week. And then he died at 65 from a heart attack while trying to organize his poetry on his table.
But I was also thinking about the plant, the guy who put the plants in the potholes in New York, which to me felt like guerrilla gardening or something. I was thinking like, there's also the question of where you put that, because within the sort of community arts it became at some point really fashionable for a while, a couple of years back, to do guerrilla gardening projects. So then it was framed as a kind of artistic practice, whereas this guy probably wouldn't care less whether or not that's connected to that. He's just doing his thing to make a statement and create a funny video to get some likes and so on.
I think like what he did in a way is really clever and beautiful. It's such a shame that the idea in his head was doing it for a YouTube video which was sponsored by a certain website. But at the end,
it
is
was
good.
sponsored also.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was sponsored by, let me see, I can find the whole video actually.
What's up, guys? Until the pot ham goes.
Yeah, it's sponsored by pranksters.com, which is a website that catalogs this sort of things. And this is the funny thing, like they do collaborations. Like if you look at the guy's name here, Cobby Person, and if you go back to the sitting on people thingy, you see the guy wearing the t-shirt. Well, and then there's of course the super famous Remy Gaillard, who's like a YouTube phenomenon, I
The
guess
original.
you call him. I guess you can call him an artist in this case, you never meant to be one.
Okay.
We're done?